Hello dear students, welcome to the 7th meeting of our syntax class. Okay, since in the previous meeting, meeting 6, we had a quiz to test your understanding about syntactic categories, phrase, endocentric and exocentric constructions. Today we are going to discuss the new topic, which is kinds of verbs. Okay, by design of this session, you'll be able to identify the different kinds of verbs, and you'll be able to give examples of different kinds of verbs also. Okay, in syntax, we have two main kinds of verbs. What are they? The first one is transitive, and the second one is intransitive. For each main kinds of verbs, we have the subkinds or the specific kinds of verbs. In transitive, we have got three kinds of verbs. They are monotransitive, detransitive, and complex transitive. Meanwhile, in intransitive, we have intransitive verbs and intensive verbs. So what is the difference of each different kinds of verbs? Now let's discuss them one by one. Okay, the first one is monotransitive. The monotransitive verbs are verbs that normally have one object. This one is the direct objects. Let me give you an example. For example, the girl likes that dog, right? The girl likes that dog. So we have the verb likes, and then we have the object that dog. And there is only one object. Therefore, the verb likes is categorized as monotransitive. Okay, the second example is the dog found a bone, right? The verb hugged has the object bone, only one object, therefore it is categorized as monotransitive verbs. Okay, the next kinds of verb is detransitive verb. D means two, therefore these verbs has two objects, direct objects and indirect objects. Okay, the examples, Ray told the children a story. So we can find the verb here is told. And then there are two objects. The first one is the children as the indirect object. And the second one is a story as the direct objects. We also have the other examples of the transitive verbs. For examples, like send and then write, and bring, make, and etc. Okay, now let's move to the next kinds of verbs. We have complex transitive verbs. So what kinds of verbs is it? Okay, in this kind of verb, the complement relates to the object, not the subject, right? So the complement refers to the objects. For example, if we have this sentence, the voters elected Mary a president. Okay, so the verb is elected, right? We have the subject, the voters, the verb elected, and then the object, Mary. And then we have the complement, a president. This complement refers to Mary, not to the voters. It refers to the objects. Therefore, it is called or it is categorized as complex transitive verbs. Okay, the next example. Kate thought John a genius, right? We have the subject, Kate. We have the verb, thought. And then we have the object, John. And then there is a complement, a genius. And genius here refers to John, not Kate. It refers to the object. Therefore, it is categorized as complex transitive verbs. We can have the other examples of complex transitive verbs such as select, think, consider, pronounce, and etc. Okay, for the next kinds of verbs, for the intransitive verbs. In these verbs, the verb do not need an object. It requires nothing else to complete the verb phrase. Okay, now let's take a look the examples to make it clearer. For example, she moved. Is it a sentence? Yes, it is a sentence because we have subject and verb. She moved. But there are only subject and verb, and it doesn't need or it doesn't require an object. And this kind of verb is called intransitive verbs. Okay, another example. The baby cried, or the baby is crying, right? We have the verb cried or crying, but without an object. It doesn't require object to make the sentence complete. This is what we call as intransitive verb. Okay, the last one is intensive verbs. In intensive verbs, it includes some categories like the relational or linking verbs or the copula. So this kind of verbs belong to a small group which includes verbs such as be, right, is, am, are, was, were, and other linking verbs like seems, appear, become, look, smell, and so on. Okay, now let's take a look at the example. George is in the garden. So what is the verb in this sentence? The verb is. The be is. This is called the intensive verb. And then the next one, Sue seems happy. The subject is Sue, the verb seems, and then there is the complement happy. So the verb seems here is considered as the linking verb, and linking verb is categorized as intensive verbs. Okay, for the be itself, is, am, are, was, were, this is the only intensive verbs which can appear with any of the phrase categories such as noun phrase, prepositional phrase, and adjective phrase. For example, be followed by noun phrase. Sally is a doctor, right? A doctor, that's the noun phrase. Sally is in the garden. So this be or intensive verbs is followed by prepositional phrase, in the garden. Sally is happy. So it is followed by adjective verbs. Okay, so at the end, we can find that there are some verbs that can belong to more than one verb classes. Is it possible? Yes, it's possible. For example, we have the verb elect, right? So previously, I mentioned elect in the examples. The voters elected Mary a president, right? But we also can have the sentence like the voters elected Mary. In this case, it is the monotransitive verbs, right? Okay, now before I close this session, now let's review about the main kinds of verbs. We have two main kinds of verbs in syntax. They are transitive and intransitive verbs. Intransitive consists of three specific kinds of verbs. They are monotransitive, detransitive, and complex transitive. Meanwhile, intransitive consists of two specific kinds of verbs, intransitive and intensive. Okay, I have provided the folder for you to do the exercises. So please give some examples of each kinds of verbs as we discussed today. You can create your own sentences, or you can take it from somewhere else, maybe from a novel, or maybe from a newspaper, or from the book that you are currently reading. Okay, thank you for today's sessions. I'll see you next meeting. See you.